All right, so let's dive right into this whole world of microfrontends. I know you've been curious about them, and honestly, same here. We've been doing a lot of research, and yeah, we've got some pretty good resources lined up. We'll try to really break this down, this whole architectural approach, I guess you'd call it.
Yeah, sounds good.
I think we can both agree that traditional monolithic frontends they just don't work, right? Especially as applications start to really scale up. They get
Yeah.
so clunky and any updates get so risky. And, well, let's just admit it, the code can turn into a real nightmare.
Yeah, you're right. It really is like trying to add, you know, like more and more floors to a skyscraper. But the foundation it's not really there,
Mm.
It's shaky. Eventually the whole thing's going to come crashing down.
Haha, that's a perfect analogy. And that's where these microfrontends come in, right?
Sure. Okay, yeah.
The whole idea is that we break down that big monolithic front end into these smaller, more manageable pieces, like micro apps, right?
Yeah.
Each one's responsible for a specific function. So it's not this giant, unwieldy thing. You have all these self-contained units that kind of work together.
Right, and that's a good thing,
Yeah.
right? Because each of these little micro apps, they can be developed and tested and deployed totally independently. Like imagine having like specialized teams working on different parts of a big complicated project. Each team can just focus on what they're good at without stepping on each other's toes all the time.
So thinking practically, how does this actually help teams? And I guess, how does it eventually benefit the end user too?
Well, first off, things just move faster. Teams can work in parallel,
Yeah.
and they could use whatever technologies work best for what they're doing.
Mm.
Like, let's say you need some crazy interactive data visualization. Well, one team might use something like D3JS for their micro app.
Okay.
But
Yeah.
then for something simple, like user profile management, another team might go with, I don't know, something lightweight like Vue.js. It's all about using the right tool for the job.
Yeah.
And having that freedom to choose is huge.
So it's kind of like, I don't know, putting together this team of all-stars, and they each have their own unique, I don't know, skill set or something.
Right.
Instead of trying to force everyone into the same, like, I don't know, mold.
Right.
Yeah.
And because all these micro apps are independent, updates are way less scary,
It's for sure.
Like if one little micro app needs an update
Mhm.
or if it completely crashes, it doesn't bring the whole application down, the other parts can keep running just fine.
That's a big deal.
Yeah. It's a big win for user experience and just the like overall stability of the system.
Yeah, that sounds like a huge advantage, especially for applications that need to always be available, like super reliable. But I'm curious, how do these little independent pieces actually talk to each other? How do
Right.
they work together?
Yeah, good question. They're not totally cut off from each other. They still got to communicate right, but in a way that doesn't tie them together too tightly. That's the whole point, to avoid that mess we had with the monolithic approach.
Yeah.
There are a couple different ways to do it, and we can get into the details later. But one common approach is using like a shared events bus or a message queue system, so they can send and receive these messages without being directly dependent on each other.
Okay, so they can still coordinate, but they're not totally, like, tangled up.
Exactly.
That makes a lot of sense. So we know there are a bunch of tools people are using to build these microfrontends. In our research, we've been looking at Webpack Module Federation, Single SPA, and then there's Vite Plugin Federation. Can you tell us why we're focusing on Single SPA for this deep dive?
Yeah, sure. All those tools have their strengths, but Single SPA kind of stands out,
Okay.
And for a few reasons. First, it's really versatile. Like, it doesn't matter what framework you're using. You can use Single SPA with React, Angular Vue, even just plain JavaScript. It's framework agnostic is what we call it.
So it's like having some kind of universal adapter.
Yeah, something like that.
You can plug anything into it.
Exactly. You're not stuck with just one ecosystem.
That's pretty powerful.
Yeah. And second, Single SPA has a really active community, lots of documentation too,
Right.
which is super important when you're learning new stuff, especially with microfrontends.
Definitely.
You want people to help you out and clear instructions to follow.
Yeah, having that community to ask questions and learn from is a game changer. It's like, I don't know, having a bunch of mentors that have already been through it all and can help you avoid all the common mistakes.
Right, totally. And finally, I think what's really cool about Single SPA is the way it handles runtime composition.
Okay.
It can dynamically load and unload micro apps as the users move in through your application. So you're only loading the code that's absolutely needed at any given time, which can make a huge difference for performance.
That's a really good point. That would be a huge benefit for those those giant complex applications, right? Where loading everything all at once up front would just kill the performance.
Exactly.
Okay, so I'm excited to see how this single spa stuff works in practice.
Yeah.
What kind of setup will we be looking at to show this in action?
Well, we're going to use something that's pretty common in e-commerce.
Okay.
Let's imagine a website with three main parts. There's navigation, products, and checkout.
Mm-hmm.
Each of those will be its own separate micro app. So for the navigation section, we'll use React, since it's a good choice for those kinds of UI components.
Right.
The navigation handles all the routing and the menu logic for the website. Then products, we'll build that with Vue.js, just to show how flexible things can be.
Okay.
And for checkout, where you need more, robust form handling and data validation, we use Angular.
That's a cool way to show how well single spa works with all these different frameworks, right?
Yeah.
It can integrate them all within a single application.
Right.
I don't know. It's like having a team of different specialists working together, and they're making this perfectly coordinated, I don't know, a symphony.
I like that analogy. And to make sure our symphony doesn't turn into total chaos, we'll also have this utility module.
Okay.
It'll be built with RxJS. It'll kind of act as a central communication hub, so our micro apps can all stay in sync, but without becoming too dependent on each other.
So it's like the conductor, right?
Yeah.
Keeping everyone on the same page.
Exactly.
Making sure it's a nice, smooth performance. So I'm ready to break down each of these micro apps and see how they all work together.
Yeah, me too. It'll be fun to see how this all works.
Awesome.
I think you'll really get a good understanding of how microfrontends work in a real world scenario once we look at this.
Well then, let's jump right into part 2. We can dissect these micro apps and see how they interact.
Yeah, let's do it.
Stick around.
All right. So, welcome back. It's time to really dig in and see how we actually build these microfrontends.
Yeah, let's get into the nitty-gritty. Last time we were talking about this e-commerce site idea, right? With the navigation, the products, and the checkout sections. Each one's a separate micro app. Let's break it down. How would these actually work, like for real?
Okay, so let's start with the navigation part. We said we'd use React for this one, right? Yeah. It's a pretty common choice for these kinds of UI components.
Makes sense.
The navigation, it handles, the navigation, all the routing and the menu logic for the whole site.
Okay, so if I don't know, let's say we wanted to add a new page, like an About Us page or something. The developers would only have to update the navigation micro app, right? Yeah. And they could deploy it without touching the products or checkout sections at all.
Exactly. Yeah. That's the whole point of this way of building things. It's modular. Changes in one spot don't mess everything else up.
Yeah, that's going to be so much easier to manage, especially when the application gets bigger and more complicated.
For sure.
And what about the product section? We chose Vue.js for that, right?
Yeah, and there's a good reason for that. Remember we were talking about how flexible microfrontends are? With the tech stack, I mean, this is a perfect example. The team working on products, maybe they really love Vue.js. Simple, easy to use.
Yeah.
And with microfrontends, they can just use it,
Okay.
It doesn't affect the rest of the application.
So even though the whole site might be using different technologies, like under the hood, from the user's perspective, it still feels like one unified experience.
Yeah, that's the goal.
Yeah.
And that's where good planning comes in. You got to have a really good design system, to make sure that even though different teams are using different frameworks, the website looks and feels consistent across the board.
It's like, I don't know, like having different chefs that specialize in different types of food, but they all use the same, like, plating standards.
Right, exactly.
The dishes look like they all belong in the same restaurant.
Yeah, I like that. So let's move on to checkout. We were going to use Angular for this one.
Right, and I bet Angular is really good for this, right, with all the forms and needing to make sure the data is all correct and everything.
Totally. Checkout usually involves a lot of steps. Payment processing, error handling. Got to make sure it's secure. Angular's perfect for that. It's got the structure and the features we need.
So it's kind of cool how each microfrontend ends up using the technology that really fits what it's supposed to do.
Yeah, it is.
But I'm still curious about how they all communicate. Like, how do they share data or trigger actions in each other?
Right. So that's where that utility module comes in. Remember we talked about that? The one with RxJS. It's kind of like this fancy messaging system. Right. Each microfrontend can subscribe to certain events or data streams, So Let's say someone adds something to their cart in the product section.
Mhm.
Well, the product's micro app sends out a message, like an item added event.
And the checkout micro app is listening for that event, and when it hears it, it updates the cart total.
Exactly. That's how it works.
That's pretty cool. So the micro apps, they don't really need to know anything about each other's like inner workings, right? They
Right.
just communicate through these messages.
Exactly. And that's how we avoid that tangled mess of dependencies that we get with those big monolithic architectures.
Right.
Much cleaner, much easier to maintain.
So everything's great then, right? No problems.
Well, there's always challenges.
Okay, so it's not all sunshine and rainbows. What kinds of problems are we talking about?
Well, for one thing, it can get complicated managing all these different code bases and deployments.
Yeah, that makes sense.
You got to have the right tools and processes to make sure everything runs smoothly.
So it takes a little more work up front.
Yeah, you could say that.
Mm-hmm.
And then there's the challenge of keeping everything consistent.
Mm-hmm.
You want to give the teams freedom, right, autonomy,
Mm-hmm.
but you also got to make sure that the user experience feels, seamless.
Right, right. So it's a balancing act.
Yeah, it is. It's finding that sweet spot between giving teams the freedom to do their thing
Hmm.
and making sure everything still looks and feels like it belongs together.
Makes sense. I guess we'll get into those challenges and how to deal with them in the next part.
Yeah, we'll dig into all that next time.
All right, so we've talked about the high level stuff, right? And even looked at how to actually implement microfrontends. But now I kind of want to talk about the hard parts, the challenges, and I guess some tips, some best practices for making this whole thing work.
Yeah, good point. It's not like a magic bullet. There's definitely stuff you got to think about, especially when you've got this distributed system. Lots of moving parts.
One of the challenges we talked about before was just the sheer complexity of it all. Managing all those different code bases, the deployments. How do teams keep track of all that? I mean, it seems like it'd be easy to get lost in a sea of repositories and build pipelines.
It can be, yeah. You really need the right tools and a good strategy for managing all those microfrontends.
Okay.
One option that can help is using what we call a monorepo setup. That's where you keep all the code for all your microfrontends in one big repository.
Okay.
It
Yeah.
makes it way easier to manage dependencies, do version control, and just generally keep track of everything.
So it's kind of like, I don't know, like a big library
Yeah, something like that.
where you've got all the blueprints for the different micro apps all organized in one place.
Exactly. And then when it comes to actually deploying the code, automation is your best friend. You want a CI/CD pipeline.
Yeah.
Continuous integration, continuous delivery. It can automatically build, test, and deploy your microfrontends with barely any human intervention.
Wow.
It's not only faster, but you're also way less likely to make mistakes.
So it's like having this well-oiled machine right, that just takes care of all the boring, repetitive stuff
Exactly.
and lets the developers focus on the creative part, writing the code.
Exactly.
So aside from the technical stuff, I'm also curious about the people side of things. Like, how do teams work together effectively when they're all working on these independent pieces?
That's a really good question. Communication is key, right? You got to have clear channels for communication, and everyone needs to understand the overall architecture, the design principles. Regular meetings, code reviews, and a well-documented design system, those are all crucial for keeping everyone on the same page.
So it's like, I don't know, like having common language, right?
Yeah.
And a set of rules that everyone understands, even though they might be using different technical, like, dialects within their own little micro apps.
Exactly. And don't forget about building a culture of collaboration.
Yeah.
People helping each other out, sharing what they've learned. That's how you avoid those silos where everyone's just doing their own thing.
Yeah, totally. So let's talk about performance. We mentioned it earlier with single SPA's runtime composition thing. Are there other things we need to think about when we're trying to make our microfrontends run as fast as possible?
Oh, absolutely. One big thing is making sure the initial load time is as fast as it can be. You want the main parts of the application up and running as quickly as possible. Techniques like lazy loading can help with that. That's where you only load a micro app when it's actually needed.
So it's kind of like, I don't know, only load in the most important chapters of a textbook first, right?
Mhm.
And then if you need more detail, you can go back and get the extra stuff later.
Exactly. Good analogy.
Mm-hmm.
And once the application's loaded, you got to make sure that moving between the different parts is smooth, the interactions are quick.
Mm-hmm.
That might involve optimizing how the micro apps talk to each other, minimizing how much data they're sending back and forth, and using efficient ways to render the content within each micro app.
It's like, I don't know, fine-tuning the engine of a car, right?
Yeah, yeah.
You want it to run smooth and get good gas mileage.
Exactly. And like with any architectural choice, there are trade-offs.
Mhm.
Microfrontends have a lot of benefits, but they do add some complexity. You got to weigh those trade-offs and decide if this approach is really right for your specific needs and the constraints of your project.
So it's about picking the right tool for the job, right?
Yeah.
And knowing what you're getting yourself into. Before we finish up, I'd love to hear about some real-world lessons you've learned from working with microfrontends. What are some things people should watch out for?
Sure. One common mistake is trying to do too much too fast. Start small,
Eh,
maybe with just one microfrontend.
yeah.
And then as you get more experience, you can gradually scale up. Don't try to do everything at once.
It's like learning a new skill, right?
Exactly.
You got to start with the basics.
Exactly. And another important thing is to be really clear about what each micro app is supposed to do.
Mm-hmm.
Define those boundaries, the responsibilities. It'll avoid a lot of confusion and make the system much easier to maintain down the road.
So have a clear plan, basically.
Yeah, pretty much.
Yeah?
And don't forget about testing.
Oh, right, of course.
With a system like this, testing is super important. You got to make sure that all the pieces work together. The changes in one micro app don't break something somewhere else.
It's like quality control for software.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So to wrap up, they're a really powerful way to build complex web applications, but they're not like a magic solution.
Right.
You got to plan carefully, understand the core concepts, and be ready to tackle the challenges that come with this approach.
Well, this has been a really cool deep dive into the world of microfrontends. We've talked about the ideas, the benefits, the challenges. Hopefully you feel like you've learned something and you can now decide if microfrontends are right for your projects.
Yeah, and just remember, web development's always changing. What's new and exciting today might be old news tomorrow. Just stay curious, keep learning, and always be open to new ideas.
Great advice. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We'll see you next time for another exploration of the world of technology.